Cymera, welcome everybody to Cymera 2026 and to our session on world weaving or word weaving, a really difficult title to read out loud, in the smaller languages of Scotland, and who knows, perhaps we'll talk about smaller languages in general. My name is Mary Kidd and I'm a writer, a frequent translator and an occasional publisher, and I work in English and Gaelic and sometimes in Scots. I've never written any sci-fi, but I have written a novel about Mary Shelley, who of course wrote one of the earliest works we could argue is in the genre. And I do write some fantasy adjacent things, so I am incredibly excited to be talking to our two authors tonight. Before I introduce them, I just want to be sure that we're clear about the two languages that we're going to be talking about. So Scotland has 4 official languages: English, BSL, Gaelic and Scots. Gaelic is a Celtic language, closely related to Irish and Manx, and more distantly to Welsh, Breton and Cornish. Scots, on the other hand, is a Germanic language, an Anglic language, and spread north, being recognised as a language in its own right from around the end of the 1400s. But both Scots and Gaelic are defined as endangered by UNESCO, and so we might refer to them in different ways as we go on. So that brings me, after my small lecture on the languages of Scotland, that brings me to our two brilliant writers that we are going to be chatting to tonight. Robin C.M. Duncan was born in Glasgow, and Glasgow remains his home. Robin is a retired civil engineer and has been writing for a long time, although he says he only began to write really seriously in the 2010s. Tonight we're going to be talking about his story, The Sariehead Free Press, from this collection, Gallus, which is a Glasgow science fiction writers' circle anthology, and we might also touch more broadly on his sci-fi. Tim Armstrong originally hails from Seattle and now lives in the Isle of Skye, a brilliant journey, I think in the right direction, where he's Associate Professor of Applied Linguistics and leads the Gaelic and Communication course at Cymera, part of the University of the Highlands and Islands. Tim's first novel, Cuan du Dreilshach, On a Glittering Black Ocean, was published in 2013, and his follow-up novel, An Luingus Dorcha et Fade, The Dark Fleet on the Horizon, was published, was it last week, Tim?
Well, last week, yeah.
Last week. So I think we need a massive round of applause for the first time Tim's seen his copy, and for Robin. Please welcome our two writers. Can I just ask, before we go into our formal questions, how is it really exciting to see your novel for the first time on stage at Cymera?
Well, yeah, this is honest. I went into the bookstore briefly, and they were loath to part with a copy. So this is the closest I've been to it since it's been published. So.
Tim is being really nice. They refused point blank to sell him a copy. So that's to prioritise copies being available for you. So I hope you feel very special, and I hope you'll take up that opportunity that's been preserved for you. Well, welcome to both of you. Thank you so much for joining us. And the first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to introduce the work we're going to be discussing to the audience in your own words. So could I start with you, Robin?
Certainly. So the work specifically that we are discussing in the Gallus anthology from the Glasgow Science Fiction Writers' Circle is my story called The Sariehead Free Press. And without delving into the thought behind it, which we'll get onto in the questions, I think basically it is a heist story. It's a short story, 7,500 words, that takes place prior to, in the lead up to Glasgow Worldcon in 2034. And it was published just before Glasgow Worldcon in 2024. Funny story, there is now actually a bid for a Glasgow Worldcon in 2034, so perhaps it's all coming true.
Brilliant, thank you so much. And Tim, will you tell us about An Luingus Dorcha et Fade?
Yeah, so it's a direct sequel to the first book, Cuan du Dreilshach, and it follows the characters from that novel and what happened to them almost immediately afterwards. And yeah, it's much larger. It could be called, I think, it's fair to call it probably cyberpunk, but it also has elements of space opera, and there's a bit of a nautical adventure, and it's set both on the Earth and in other places, and it has a lot more characters than the first one is. So it's a lot more, and a lot more settings and I use a lot of different language in it, so it's a much more complex and much longer book.
It's quite interesting that we're here to talk about kind of two extremes. We've got a really quite extent novel, and then we've got a short story, and really brilliant that we're celebrating all of the different forms that prose can take. I think that's really lovely, so thank you. Both writers will, of course, be signing their books, so you'll get a chance to pick up that nice hefty volume and the beautiful Gallus, and indeed other books in the shop. Before we come on to talk about language and how you both engage with and use language, can I ask you just why sci-fi? Can I ask you about your sort of journey as readers and writers of sci-fi? Why is it your form? Can I start with you, Robin?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the answer for me is fairly straightforward. My dad was a physics teacher, and the first book he gave me was a collection of short stories by Larry Niven, The Flight of the Horse, and I think really it started there. I come from a family of engineers on both sides, so I think that must be in my DNA somewhere. And so the sci-fi actually came before the engineering, but the two very much go hand in hand, I think. I like fantasy as well. I write a bit of fantasy from now and again, but as an engineer my whole life, science fiction appeals to that technical, that wish to understand the technicalities of how things work.
Brilliant. I'm interested in that because I'm the child of a history teacher and I write historical fiction. I wonder if either of us were the child of a home ec teacher. Do you think we'd be here writing cookbooks?
That's a big question, possibly for another panel.
Tim, how did you become a sci-fi reader and a sci-fi writer?
It's not actually that different from your story, actually. I come from a family of biologists, and I have a background in biology before I started doing sociolinguistics. So I've been around science my whole life, and I also started reading really early science fiction. I actually had trouble reading when I was young. I struggled for a while, and the first kind of actual book I read was Dune. And I was fortunate enough I lived just north of Seattle, and so I actually got to go see Frank Herbert speak while I was reading that book. And so, yeah, I think in the same way, science fiction just feels very, very natural for me, and particularly as someone who's interested also in sociology, and it's a good marriage of my interests in trying to understand how technology impacts the way society works. And so, yeah, so kind of the same, very same story probably, yeah.
And then, of course, the thing that you have in common that we're here to discuss is the fact that you are taking all of that kind of appeal that the form has for you, and you're playing with it and writing it in the smaller languages of Scotland. Obviously, different scale languages in the sense, I think it's 1.5 million people are generally report themselves as Scots speakers, and in the census more like something like 60,000, a bit under, for Gaelic. Why, I'll start with you, Tim, why do you write in Gaelic, and why does sci-fi appeal in Gaelic?
Yeah, I think I've been writing since I was quite young, and but when the opportunity came to write in Gaelic, it kind of there was something really magical about writing in a second language. For me, obviously, someone from Seattle, Gaelic is my second language, and it was a very exciting thing to do, to write in my second language, and I really, really enjoyed it. So that was my first. The main reason that I did it was that I enjoyed it. It was for some extent and I've talked about this before. That it's for me, it's also language learning for me. That I got to a level of reasonable fluency, and I would suggest anyone who gets to a level of pretty good fluency in a language, one of the best ways to reach really good fluency in a language is write a novel in it. And so I spent my writing practice was to sit down and I would read a couple pages of a dictionary and write out every idiom and every word on those couple pages that I thought would be interesting or I might use. I wrote them down in my journal, and eventually read through, in the course of writing these novels, read through, well, I finished a dictionary and then read through other things that I would always start my writing day, kind of learning a bit of Gaelic before I started writing. And then, of course, I think as someone who works full-time in Gaelic and I teach literature in Gaelic, I think that it's really important that we have a wide range of literature in Gaelic. So I do have that motivation as well to be writing Gaelic. I think Gaelic needs sci-fi. So yeah.
Brilliant. And also quite, very impressive, but also, I don't know about anybody else here who might have learned a language ever, but it makes me feel like an underachiever. Robin, why Scots?
Yes. Well, the Sari Heed Free Press is the only story I have written in Scots, and I specifically chose to do that because the idea behind the Gallus anthology was to celebrate the genre community in Glasgow and Glasgow's tradition in advance of, as part of Glasgow Worldcon. We had the book launch at Glasgow Worldcon, we had another one at Watersons, and so I thought, well, if I'm going to do that, I want to lean into that hard, and just take in as many influences and represent as many influences of my own writing as I can. And I thought that the way to do that was to write in what I call Glasgow Scots. And because, the title of the book is Gallus, and what better way to communicate that Gallus spirit of Glasgow than through the language, I think. I reckon I saved myself a good sort of 1,500 words of description by just using that language, which I think brings with it images and recollections to people, not just Glaswegian people, but anyone I think who's had any interaction with Scots, even if it's only watching Kevin Bridges on the television. I think it still creates an immediate vibe, a feeling that it would be much harder to construct, if that's the right way, in English.
That's a really nice intro, I think, for me to ask if you would maybe read us a wee taster. It's difficult
Certainly.
asking someone to read a wee taster of something short, but if you wouldn't mind.
I wouldn't mind at all. I did this same reading at EasterCon in Birmingham, so the reception was good. There's a little bit of swearing in it. I hope you don't mind.
Is everybody all right with swearing?
It's Glaswegian. Next to the Australians, I think, that's a bit of an inevitability. What else? There's some accents. The Glasgow one, hopefully, I can do reasonably well. And in fact, there's a kind of modified Glasgow one, which will become apparent. So, a quick context. I'm not starting at the beginning. There's 11 sections in the story. This is section 3. As I said, it's a heist story. Monty Johnson is the lead character, and he is putting the team together for the heist. And I will stand up for this, if that's okay. Hopefully the mic won't get upset. So, this section is called Schrodinger's Flat. The fellow I'm away to see next is the team member least well known to me. But I need a certain kind of techie, and this one's got a very particular suite of apps. This punter Andrew is one of Senga's tutors at Strathclyde Uni. Senga's a diamond. She's my Auntie Jackie's uncle's asylum-seeking neighbours girl. Asylum for Edinburgh, that is. She's putting herself through medical school with this garage gig, studying bio something techie what's it. Oh, at 17. Not even old enough to binge drink under the council's latest edict. Anyhow, I know nothing about this guy, so here goes nothing. I buzz the door, and my camera scams me. I know this because my phone tells me. Can't see the camera, but the door clicks open, and I enter the dark close. Shiny tiles restored lightly by Holyrood government money before the cessation and the inception of the glorious Socialist Republic of Glasgow. No sarcasm, by the way. I'm all for a new square green deal, a fair pay for a carbon negative day's work and all that. Up the stone stairs I go, Scuffs echoing in the stairway to flat 3-1. Quite a hoof, I'm fair puffed the time I reach the tap. The left hand of 2 doors facing across the landing clicks open and swings shut behind me, servos whining. No much of a trick, really. Come through, someone calls for the high-ceilinged living room. Andrew spins round in one of the grand gaming chairs, turning away for a big monitor array in front of a bay window. But not this room's bay window, and not this room's monitor array. Andy's not in this room at all. He's on a big panel screen sitting in an exact replica of this room. The effect is disconcerting as fuck. I open real smooth. What is this shit? Where are you? How do you get the electric ration for this lot? It's a low-power setup, says the short beardie on the screen, waving an arm encompassing both mountains of tech. His face fuzz is tidy, and he's trim, no your standard main crop couch potato. I note the treadmill and static bike in the corner. The bike's cabled into mission control. Self-generation? Exactly. I power the lot myself. Storage cells under the desk. Kitchen? No need. Deliverama, no drama. He parrots the ubiquitous home delivery slogan. There's a kettle somewhere, but that's a lot of peddling when I can order in. Fair dues. So where the actual fuck are you? Ah, well, just before you came in, I might have been here and I might not. There was an equal chance. Stop, you're right there, Professor. You know my auntie's B.S. Macduff, preeminent SF author. And I'm well enough read myself to know that Schrodinger's Moggy isn't the scenario here. So unless you want to learn if these expensive-looking tellies bounce in the street, just come clean. Andrew tells me to wait. He'll be right there. I see him come for a close over by, cross the street, enter the tenement. He arrives in the flat, sits down in the chair before me, his backdrop now the empty gaming chair on the big screen. What do you know? The professor is in. I believe I've won this particular thought experiment, Andy boy.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think it's a real joy to hear it in your voice, because we've all probably got an idea of a Glasgow. If those of us who are not from Glasgow have an idea of Glasgow in our heads, and it's just brilliant to hear it brought to life. I was going to ask, before we asked him to read, how many of you are Gaelic speakers? Okie dokes. I'll definitely ask him not to read the entire extract in Gaelic in that case. Had you all put your hands up, I would have said we could have had a Gaelic-only reading. But Tim has very kindly translated his reading for us. But I'll ask you, Tim, when you read, to give us a wee taste of the Gaelic first for our representative of Gaeldom. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, excellent. So I've decided it was very difficult to select a piece that that wouldn't spoil both books, and so I've just selected at the very beginning of this book, and so there's mild spoilers if you haven't read this book, but not too bad. So to set it up, we're with our protagonist, a cybernetic human being named Ahim, and he's, as we'll see, he's flying in to Earth, and he's flying in his ship in Lasseril, and that means kind of roughly the flame of love, and it's almost a character in the first novel, and a ship that he's stolen, and he's thinking about his friends down on the planet, and so I'll just read a little bit in Gaelic first. Mr. Chleich Cantastis an Ling. Hron rauig abaluga ag Ahim gan roi fo Yunsi. Ik in aum, vai na huye ik in stu de feu na host agus a legurui le smunchin. In jerk na charoia, vai coit ia vai de flanage lia tundig fo a gumal and talu. Van lasser gul an an kurst ishel, begin is koi kiet kilometer is kun na alia de talavine. Agus in impische dol tor shias januacher. Uners gan rugge in unig interki kerst. Okay.
That's what NASA would sound like in Gaelic.
So here's what I just said, and I'll read a little further. Before the missile slammed into the ship, Ahim didn't have the slightest warning that he was under attack. At the time, he was sitting at the helm, relaxed and daydreaming. On a monitor in front of him, he watched a light blue planet slowly turn below him, the Earth. And Lasseril was in low orbit, about 500 kilometers above the Earth's atmosphere, and he was about to take her down to the surface once they arrived at the best window of re-entry. He was remembering the last day he was on this planet, swimming in the oceans below, through coral and schools of multicolored fish with his friend Riasa. They'd been working together now for more than 6 years, and although he wouldn't say that he knew her well yet, he enjoyed her company. He remembered how happy she was the day that she eagerly explored the reefs, looking back at him from time to time with a smile on her face. They paused for a bit when she took special interest in a toothy eel she found, the creature's angry head sticking out of the lair in the coral and his mouth gaping like a trap. "Did you see that old guy?" she said when they returned to the surface. "Amore, I believe," he said. "Be careful, there's venom in the teeth." Ahim didn't need to come up to the surface. He didn't require oxygen. But Riasa was half biological, and she would gasp for air after each dive. "What a face," she said between breaths, and then she swam down again to study the fish some more. Ahim followed her, descending to the seafloor and finding a seat on the sand where he could watch them both, a girl and a fish, an alien and an earthling, meeting under the waves. Where was she now? That was his last thought when the alarm rang out from the instrument desk in front of him, shaking him out of his daydream. The proximity warning flashed red and then chunk. The impact was like a blow in the back of his chair, and he threw his hands forward so that he wouldn't hit his head on the desk. He looked to the screen. In place of the view outside, a schematic of the ship appeared with a yellow cross indicating that the hull of the Lasseril had been breached, about a meter behind the core of the reactor, close to the fuel store. Ahim instantly realized that he had been fired upon. He didn't know how or why, but it was clear from the information flashing before his eyes that the ship had been hit by some sort of weapon. It was a precise hit, in the very spot that would cause the most harm. The screen filled with information about the damage, and far faster than any creature with a biological brain could manage, the cyborg absorbed the data. There's no two ways about it. The reactor was going to explode. He grabbed for the helm and aimed the Lasseril directly down at the Earth below. Whoever was attacking him up here in space, with his ship coming apart around him, he was an open target. But if he could get down to the surface of the planet before the engines exploded, he could try to escape on foot. He pushed her down as aggressively as he dared, and the ship's fuselage groaned under the acceleration. The deck began to glow beneath his feet, the reactor melting rapidly in the engine room below, and the cockpit filled with the sharp smell of smoke. The fire suppression system deployed, spraying carbon dioxide around his head, and an oxygen mask dropped in front of his face. He slapped it away. He hoped he might have a few minutes to bring the ship down to the surface, but he didn't. Close to 6 seconds after Lasseril was hit, a red light flashed on the screen, indicating that the containment field surrounding the antimatter in the engine was failing. That's it, he thought. She's lost. He didn't have time to rise from his seat or even to move his body to protect himself. It was over in an instant. And Lasseril was annihilated in a huge ball of fire. Through his closed eyelids, the cyborg caught a brief glimpse of the blazing white explosion just before his artificial mind made an emergency power down as it was slammed with a blast of electromagnetic radiation of over 50 kilovolts per meter squared.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Tim, you should do trailers for films. You've got an amazing reading voice.
Thank you.
I hope that's given you a real feel for the work. And I want to ask you both about your influences in Scots and in Gaelic. Whether or not you know, your influences in general, you don't have to stick with sci-fi in answering this, but also, you know, is there sci-fi out there that you've read in the languages and that kind of sort of helps you imagine your way into it? Or are you really cutting your own path? I'll maybe start with you, Robin, if I may.
Yes, not particularly, I think, science fiction in Glaswegian. I'm not aware that there's an awful lot of it about, and for what it's worth, I have an idea for a second short story in this particular world that I've written. But influences, I mean, not particularly as Scots, but certainly Scottish authors. I mean, Ian M. Banks is probably my literary hero, but I love the work of Ken MacLeod, for example. And Ken, whilst not necessarily writing in Scots, has written, has a series of novels which is kind of like, and I'm not meaning to sound dismissive, but like Scots in space, if you like. It sort of charts the journey of spacefaring being originated in Greenock, where Ken lives. And there's a trilogy. They go out into the stars, but starting from building a ship in Greenock. So there are touch points, I think, with my Scottish heritage, if you like, without actually necessarily being stories in Scots.
Would it be cheeky to ask you if you're familiar with Tay-Sliders in Space by Chewing the Fat?
Yes.
I love that line, Captain, there's a right big hooray spaceship coming right at us. It's like hee-haw
Yes.
we've ever seen before.
I wouldn't like to say that was an influence, but I am aware of it, yes.
I was also going to ask you whether or not you've read any of Lewis Grassic Gibbon, James Leslie Mitchell's sci-fi, because I always think it's a shame in a way that he didn't write that in Scots or in his Scottish inflected English.
Yeah, I'm afraid I have not,
No.
although I'm aware of its existence. The Mitchell Library did a display, it was probably a year ago, it might be two, of Scottish origins of science fiction, or origins of Scottish science fiction and fantasy, if you like. And so I became aware then that there's a lot I've missed out on, I think, to get to this point. So I shall need to go back.
Brilliant work. I think you'll enjoy it. Tim, who are your Gaelic writing heroes, sci-fi or otherwise?
Yeah, well, in terms of sci-fi, I think when I started writing, I didn't imagine there would be much sci-fi in Gaelic, but then took an interest in it, and there was a really good list produced of Gaelic sci-fi, and I started reading through that list, and I found others as well, so there's more than one might imagine. In general, when reading in Gaelic, since I teach literature in Gaelic as well, I do a lot of reading through my work. And Ian McAgoin is one of, so Ian Creighton Smith, is actually one of the more prolific sci-fi writers in Gaelic. And I really, really like his fiction. But I think also, and again, I'm stealing all your lines, but Ian M. Banks was an enormous influence on me. And in fact, when I was writing the first novel, I had The Algebrist, which is my favorite of his books. I had that beside the bed, and I would occasionally just reread it because I really liked his voice, and I couldn't replicate his voice in Gaelic, but kind of his voice inspired me. And I'm also interested in general in that kind of science fiction that is simultaneously kind of hard science fiction, tries to get a lot of the science right, but it's also social science fiction that its main focus is about, again, sociology and understanding us as technological beings. So, particularly, and these books deal with it, I'm very interested in the interface of artificial intelligence and biological intelligence and the technological singularity. And when I started writing this 14 years ago, that seemed further away. And writing it now, publishing this book now, feels much, much closer than it did 14 years ago. So yeah, but I think it's fair to say that in terms of science fiction, my influences would mostly be from science fiction written in English, and Ian M. Banks particularly.
Isn't it fascinating, that idea that you started writing something and so much changed so rapidly in that period,
Yeah.
but isn't it incredible that so much sci-fi is so very prescient? I was talking about Leslie Mitchell, which was seeing mankind destroy its home on this planet, thinking about things like Frankenstein that was about creating a monster and unleashing it. It's just an amazing form for that, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, there's kind of two. I feel there's two forces at work there, because they do say that someone said, and I don't disagree with them, that science fiction stories are about today. They're commenting on the lives that we have. But then, of course, there has to be that strand of prediction. So maybe it's the sociological aspects that are commenting on our life, but the technological strands are very much trying to predict, what might happen. And that's getting harder, as you say, because it's happening so fast. But I mean, I think of Arthur C. Clarke and, so much of his prognostication and things that he imagined and that have come to pass. But in a good way, in terms of maybe something like satellites, but Charlie Strauss wrote a fabulous article for BSFA's Focus magazine about how the tech bros are trying to bring about things written about and imagined in science fiction novels of the 70s or whatever, their youth, without understanding that these are bad things. We were telling these stories because we didn't want, these are warnings, these are not a shopping list.
Yeah, that's a good point. On a flip of that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about writing communities, because Cymera strikes me as the brilliant kind of embodiment of how much of a community there is around sci-fi and fantasy. Have you found the same in terms of writing communities in Gaelic and in Scots? Are there writing communities, and are they things you draw on? And I know, Robin, that you're also involved very specifically with a sci-fi community. Can I ask a wee bit, maybe in the first case, about that?
Sure. Well, I hope no one in the audience took offence at the wee dig about cessation from Edinburgh in that reading, because I would like to think there's a friendly rivalry, a bit of banter between Edinburgh and Glasgow.
I did get booed on stage by some Waterson's booksellers when I said I lived in Edinburgh recently in
But
Sophie Hall Street.
It's definitely the banter, definitely. Yes, I am a member of the Glasgow Science Fiction Writers Circle. Science fiction, I mean, it's a very broad group. Science fiction, yes, fantasy, horror, weird, all sorts of genres are welcome. As long as there's some genre element, that's the only thing that there was, I think, one or two stories that didn't get into the anthology because they were just too light on the genre. But it's a very broad church with a small c. I've been a member since, I think it was 2016-ish. But the Glasgow group, we do online and in-person sessions alternately each week. So that aspect of, and we tend to socialise and do a lot of things together as well. So it's a close group. But its ethos is, like, I'm also a member of the ESF, the Edinburgh Science Fiction Fantasy Writers Discord, and that group, I think they accept members from wherever. Glasgow, there's a sort of soft stipulation that you should at least be able to physically attend a session. So there is a point at which geographically we kind of say, we're not accepting members from North Carolina, for example, who are going to only be on the Zoom sessions. So we do, there's a certain preservation of the identity of the group, I think, which in that way, which is to its benefit, I think, is a strength.
Is it something, does it kind of keep you going as a writer? Is it something that kind of, does it motivate you? Does it, as some people say, keep you accountable?
Oh, yeah, it's hugely motivating. Since COVID, that was when we started doing Zoom sessions. Everything was Zoom, and then we went back. We doubled the number. We used to be fortnightly, now we're weekly, and we do alternate Zoom and in person. There's about 90 people on the Discord. We moved from web-based chat room to Discord, and there's about 90 members, but they're not all active at once. But it's not a small community. It's a fairly sizable community. And I wandered away from your question a little bit. What was the?
Is it kind of like
the
tool
motivational? Yes, thank you. So no, it is very motivational. I mean, there are writers at every level of their writing journey. There are writers who have been published many times for many years, and there are writers who are just new to it, maybe even writing their first story. So there's a huge range of experience, and within that there are people who've won awards, there are people who are just getting agents, for example, and people who self-publish. You know, there's a big variation in experience, with the result that there's always someone you can talk to about the particular thing, the particular problem you're having, or the challenge you've got, whatever, whether it's in writing or it's in the business side, the publishing side of things. And we operate on, I should throw in there, we all use the Milford method of critique, where, you know, each person has a turn before, and then the author stays silent and then feeds back at the end, which I think again is, I find that very motivational. I think you learn so much from seeing what someone else has seen in a story that you maybe didn't see, and I mean the learning of craft that is involved is very inspirational, and then people will constantly encourage you to progress your writing and to submit things and move forward.
That's brilliant. It's really good to hear. Tim, does Gaelic have an active community of writers, that kind of mutual support? I mean, I appreciate also that not every writer wants it, but, you know, does it exist? Is it something that you're keen to kind of take advantage of?
Well, yeah, as you were speaking, I was trying to think, what is my community of writers? And I think that for me, it's, I'm a lecturer at Solomon Ostig, the Gaelic College on the Isle of Skye. And for me, I think my community is the college. And both my students and creative writing is an important part of the course I teach, but also my colleagues. She just retired, but I was across the hallway from Meg Bateman, a very well-known Gaelic poet, and many of my other colleagues are writers. And I write fiction, but I also have, of course, as an academic, I have to be writing for my job as well, both in English and in Gaelic. And I wrote my PhD in Gaelic, and I got a lot of help from my colleagues when I was doing that. And that probably, I would say that I had to write, 90,000 words in Gaelic for my PhD really helped encourage me then that I could write at length in Gaelic to do fiction as well. So I think the college is my writing community, and very supportive one. Yeah,
it's really really good to hear. And that links to the other thing that I wanted to ask you, which is about audience readership. I think it might be fair to say that Gaelic has literacy. The community of Gaelic speakers were disenfranchised in the sense that many people didn't have access to education in their own language. So there are literacy challenges. And Scots has perhaps had historically some similar experiences, and perhaps also status challenges in both cases. So, I mean, you might have partly answered this, Tim. How do you kind of get a feel for audience, and do you get kind of positive response from people kind of, inspired to read by the fact that you're writing?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I was working it out the other day I was answering a question for somebody, and in the latest census, about 60,000 people reported that they were literate in Gaelic. They could read in Gaelic, and it's hard to say what that 60,000 means. And does that mean they can read a little bit, or they would feel confident reading a novel? I would imagine those that would be confident to read a novel would be much less than that. And as part of my course, my students read over the course of the year 7 adult novels, and for them, it's rare that I get students that isn't something new for them, that they have to read something of length. So I think it's in the back of your head always when you're writing in Gaelic that Gaelic literacy in the Gaelic-speaking community is an issue, and I'm not sure. I get feedback that my writing is approachable. I want my writing to be approachable. I don't deliberately try to make my writing opaque. I do, though, want to talk about the core of the reactor failing and the engine's about to explode, and so he sees on the monitor, and so there's by necessity vocabulary that may not be isn't daily daily Gaelic, and so I would hope that through context, and carefully doing it through context, that it remains approachable. But that is, I think, yeah, particularly in Gaelic, more than would be maybe if you were writing in English. It's in the back of your head that you want to make sure you're not writing past people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there an audiobook planned?
There was an audiobook made of the first one, and I don't know if it's still for sale or what happened with that. But it would be, that is very right, that that's another way to make Gaelic literature approachable, particularly to older folk who wouldn't have had Gaelic medium education and might not feel as confident about reading. Yeah, definitely.
No, that's fascinating. And, Robin, what's the sort of audience reception been for you and for writing in Scots?
Yeah, it's an interesting one with it being, my story being in an anthology, and there is one other story by Hal Duncan in this book that is also in Scots, and if you ever get a chance to hear Hal read it, I would recommend it because it's quite an experience. So there were those two stories out of 25, which are very much Glasgow influenced, but still but written in English. As I say, my reading in Birmingham went very well. I think people got it; they laughed in the right places, and obviously there's a lot of English in it, if you like. There's certain words that are different, of course, and I think it's easier to understand probably hearing it read than reading it maybe on the page if you're not familiar with the Glasgow Scots. There was one review of the book that stood out to me because it mentioned all the stories that were in English and didn't mention the two that were in Scots, which I thought, and I tell myself that perhaps the reviewer didn't feel confident in talking about those stories because of it being an unfamiliar language or an unfamiliar cant, if you like, on the English content. So yeah, I mean, I think in general it's well received, and certainly maybe it comes across better when read. I don't know, when all the or certainly comes across to shall we say non-Scots or people who haven't spent any time in Glasgow. Maybe it comes across more easily when it's read rather than off the page.
I think there's sometimes a tendency in people, isn't there, to slightly panic. Like I've lived my entire life with a name that panics anyone south of Newcastle. As soon as they see me coming, they're, I can't pronounce their name. I don't know how to pronounce their name. So I think there is something natural that people do clam up, maybe. But it's important that we do it, of course. And I wanted to ask you both, what does it give you writing in those languages? We've talked about some of the reasons you might choose to do it from the point of view of supporting the contexts. But what tools as a writer, what does it offer you that you don't get writing in standard English? You've kind of touched on it a wee bit, Robin.
Yeah. I mean, I think I mentioned at the beginning about sense of place, and that kind of like a shortcut almost to a very immediate sense of place for a lot of people, I think, just through those forms of expression and that language. I think it brings out, just by its nature, that what I was going for, the gala spirit, the enthusiasm, the humour. I tell myself that I'm funnier in Glaswegian Scots than I am in English. Other people would need to judge that, but I had more fun writing it. I had a different kind of fun writing it than perhaps just in straight English, we call it that. So it gave things to me, I think, in my experience, and I hope that kind of reinforced. There was a kind of reinforcement loop there that found its way into the story and perhaps energized it more and than perhaps I still think I do think if I'd written that in in English, it would have felt very different, I think.
No, absolutely. Tim, same question for you. What tools do you feel? Does it give you any kind of advantages and tricks?
I'm not sure. I was thinking about this question, and in the first instance, I think these two books have to be in Gaelic because I lean very heavily on Gaelic itself. And for instance, a lot of the characters, I've decided that they will be in different Gaelic dialects, and so selected different Gaelic dialects for those characters. And there's a lot of just reference to Gaelic itself in the novels. I think it would, I think it. Well, this one's been translated into Irish, and I think that's close enough of a reach. But I think that I definitely was drawing specifically strongly on the Gaelic language itself to make the novels work. For me, as a writer, what I get out of it is partly just the opportunity to live inside a story in Gaelic. And I think that's one of the things, thinking of literature as a particular tactic in language revival and language revitalization, is that it gives you the opportunity to, which is very rare in the real world, to be, if you were to read this novel, and it might, depending on how long it took you to read, you would be spending many hours in an entirely Gaelic world. And when I was writing it, it allowed me to spend hours at a time in a completely Gaelic environment. It's like a little Gael talk to the mind when you're reading a novel. And so that's what I'm hoping to give the reader, but also as the writer, that was what I was trying to create. And it's not just an English. It's not a sci-fi novel I have in English in my head that I've translated to Gaelic. It exists it is truly a Gael talk of its own between the pages.
I wondered, this is a slightly nosy question, but thinking to what you said, that Ian Crichton-Smith, Ian McElgoin, wrote quite a lot of sci-fi, I think I've always slightly wondered, in a way, does it also give you a chance that you can have a fully Gaelic world? Because we all know that Gaelic speakers code switch. Yeah. If you're going to be engaging, say, with a bank teller or the NHS, you're probably going to use English. You might use Gaelic differently. So, does it give you the chance to create a fully Gaelic world?
Absolutely. And when we look at the novels with my students, it's really interesting to see how different Gaelic authors have handled the other language, because that's always an issue if you're writing in Gaelic. But Gaelic, of course, exists in the world with English. You're trying to write a Gaelic novel. Well, how do you handle the parts that are going to be in English? Do you translate them into Gaelic? Do you just write them out in English? Do you do something else? And you get to completely swerve that if you set it in space, because, of course, Han Solo is speaking my dialect of English because that's how the Star Wars is represented in space. And so as soon as you establish that the aliens just speak Gaelic, and that's the language that they are, and though they come down onto the Earth, how I've decided to deal with English is that I borrowed a tactic that's been used in Irish before, is that I've written the English using Gaelic orthography. So if you read it out loud and you know how Gaelic is spelled, you can then understand what they're saying in English. And then in this novel, I actually then also did, there's a little bit of Spanish that I did in the same way. And so, but it allows you to completely swerve that question, what to do with English.
That's fascinating. There is time for some questions. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? And we have a roving mic, I believe. So we've got a question up the back.
So this is actually from the live stream, and it's a two-parter, so bear with me. So first off, what would you like to see more of in the relevant languages sci-fi book scene? So either in Gaelic or in Scots. And then the second part of the question is, are there any areas where you've noticed omissions when it comes to dialects, themes, or inclusion of marginalised perspectives? I don't
That's
know who
a
wants to go
big
first.
question.
Wow.
It is a big question.
Eight questions.
Go ahead.
Is there anything I'd like to see more of? I'm going to. I think the thing about English is that we talked about in the green room, but I didn't mention it when you asked that question, is that because English is so proliferated around the world, you know, it's a lingua franca in so many different areas, like politics and science and what have you, that it's almost been sanitized and lost a lot of its power. It's sort of, I mean, I'm sure people, you know, in Liverpool, for example, still speak, particularly Newcastle, but the way it's presented to the world, English is very, very standardized. So rather than being specific about Scots, I was hoping to mention Deep Wheel Orcadia, for example, by Harry Josephine Giles. But the work that Oliver K. Langmead is doing with English in terms of, you know, writing novels in verse and basically being inventive with English, and or you know, taking that approach of merging languages, constructing languages. There's a new novel out recently by Mahmoud El Sayed, The Republic of Memory, and he's got a conlang, a constructed language in that called New Paul. And just basically being inventive with, yes, your own language or someone else's language, you know, adopting and trying things. And certainly something I love. In a way, I wasn't doing it with the Sari Heat Free Press. I wasn't inventing anything. I was just using the language that I knew. But in my science fiction novels, I like nothing better than inventing words and like new slang. And one of the characters is Italian, so I give little bits of Italian. And I think just exploring language, that's the thing. And not all, you don't need all novels to do that. Of course, people are going to write brilliant novels in English without you know, sort of messing around with the language. But as long as there are still people, you know, trying new things and that they're being published and that people have the opportunity to read that, I think that's what's important.
And maybe there's a point that actually, what you say about English, we almost become blind to it. The vast majority of people being monoglots become blind to language.
Yeah.
And so you're kind of centering it in really interesting ways. Tim, is there anything you'd like to see more of in Gaelic, and any kind of gaps that you see in the Gaelic sci-fi?
Well, I think I would just like to see more novels in Gaelic. And I'm kind of an evangelist with my students. I think that a vibrant literary scene, and particularly novel, is possibly the quintessential modern art form, is really, really important in languages. As you know, Gaelic is incredibly rich as a literary language, one of the oldest languages written in Europe. This enormous oral literature that's been collected, but it came for reasons that are path-dependent and historical. It came to the novel particularly late. So while poetry and short stories are gigantic in Gaelic, there's less novels. But I think novels are really important for providing that opportunity to immerse yourself in the language, and really important for language revival. So I would just say more novels. I think of the Icelandic example where they say that 1 in 10 Icelandic people will write a novel in their life in Icelandic. Wouldn't it be amazing if writing novels just became something that Gaelic speakers did, and that we had? So I really want to encourage my students to feel confident to do that, and to make more novels. In terms of, I think part of the question was about dialects, wasn't it? And the gaps.
Any omissions when it comes to dialects, themes, or inclusion of marginalised perspectives?
Yeah, so one thing I did in this one that is a little bit controversial is I did all these different dialects, and I also put one of the planets speaks in Gaelic medium education English, and that was really, really controversial.
We've actually got a bodyguard for Tim on the way.
I had lots of arguments with my editors. Did not want to do that, and because. But I think in the future that, and Meg Bateman has written about this, that may become a dialect of Gaelic, and is that wrong? And I wanted to include that in there as well as you know, that certainly we're all aiming to speak the best Gaelic we have. I'm not making an argument against that, but at the same time, Gaelic can't exclude anyone at this stage, and so. Yeah, maybe more Gaelic medium education Gaelic.
Well, that's a lovely note, I think. Unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time. But the great advantage to you who are here in person, if you want to ask a question, is that we'll be going down to sign the books. So please do come and have a chat with Robin and have a chat with Tim, and you can talk. Obviously, you can explore any of the themes that we've discussed. We didn't even get on to thorny questions like orthography because the conversation kind of went in its own way, as is the joy of such things. So could you please join me in giving Tim Armstrong and Robin Duncan a massive round of applause. Carefully. Thank you so much.
Very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.
Shoshing.